It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shelley Chandler, Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs, who will introduce our guest speaker this morning.
Thank you. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Gary Karton. Gary was introduced to us by Daryl Brewer, father of Beacon College student Antonio Myers. Thank you, Daryl, for the introduction. Gary began his career as a sports writer at the Washington Post. For the past 17 years, Gary has worked with parents and children at nonprofit organizations, including the Welfare to Work Partnership and the Save Kids Worldwide. Gary is also an author. He wrote No Free Lunch, One Man's Journey from Welfare to the American Dream. He is currently working on a spirit animal fantasy series for kids 7 to 13 years of age. The first book in his series has earned him a number of literary awards. But what is really relevant to us at Beacon College is that Gary grew up with a learning disability. Gary struggled with dyslexia all throughout school. He was inspired by a teacher, and Gary accommodated his learning disability to become a successful author today. So each of us at Beacon College hope that we too, in the same manner, can inspire our students. Soon perhaps to surpass J.K. Rowling. Here, please welcome Mr. Gary Karton.
Thank you, everybody, so much for having me. I like to keep my expectations very low, so I don't think I'll be surpassing J.K. Rowling anytime soon. I cannot thank President Dr. Haggerty and Mrs. Marinakis and everybody for inviting me here today to be part of this celebration. People say thank you, and I just say I can't think of any other place I would rather be. Everything that you guys do is exactly what I believe in. It's what I've grown up with, and it's just I can't even believe I'm sitting here when they're saying all these great things about people. I'm like, I don't think I belong here, but I really appreciate being here. To the founders, I could probably spend my entire time talking about how amazing you are. But instead, I will probably just start by saying you're heroes. I'm sure you've heard that before. The difference that you've made in people's lives is the greatest gift you can give. And I just thank you on behalf of everyone who's grown up struggling to learn. I thank you so much for what you did. To the parents who send your kids here, if your kids are anything like mine, they might not thank you as much as you probably deserve. And if they do thank you, then I'm going to need some parenting advice after this, please. But again, as someone who grew up struggling to learn and someone who didn't always appreciate the adults in my life who tried to inspire me and encourage me, thank you so much for what you're doing to guide your kids and give them opportunities. And really, opportunities is what it's all about. And finally, to the students, my favorite part, I want to say thank you for being awesome. I want to explain that a little bit. I know I don't know you, although I feel like I do from hearing stories about the students that go here. My wife works for George Mason University. She said, do not say kids, and I totally blew that. About the students who go here, I have a really strong belief that every single person has special powers. I know that sounds corny, so hear me out real quick. It doesn't mean you can fly, and when I'm talking to younger kids, I say don't jump off the roof and pretend like you can fly. And when I was a kid, I used to let spiders crawl on me, and I was hoping to get Spider-Man's powers if they bit me, which I knew it was a long shot, but I thought it'd be worth the risk if that could happen, and I don't recommend that either. Those spider bites itch, and I spent a lot of time in oatmeal baths and stuff like that. But I do believe that there is something every person has that's extraordinary that makes them amazing, whether it's you can run just a little bit faster, you're a little bit more creative, you are an artist, you love music, you can see the good in everybody, which my wife has that special power. You can see that somebody's a little bit down and maybe say just the right thing to make them feel better. Those are amazing gifts that people have, and I believe that if you believe in them and you work hard enough, those special powers will continue to grow your entire life. So, only 17 more pages to go. I'm just kidding. Of course, I did not always feel this way. You know, growing up, you could have bet a lot of money that I would not be here right now talking to you. And recently, you can bet even more money that I'd not be in a suit. My kids, when I walked out with this, were like, "Are you going to a Halloween party?" You know, they're just, especially with this orange tie, just me in a suit is very, very rare. But again, I'm happy to do anything for this event. But when I was in the third grade, I got pulled out of my reading class, which was, of course, humiliating. And the teacher pulled me aside and she said, "Do you know what a learning disability is?" And I said, "No." And she said, "It's a gift." She said, "You learn things and you see things differently than other people, but different is good." And every Wednesday we would get together and we would work on ways for me to improve my reading. We would tape record my voice. In those days they had these little, it was almost like a credit card machine, and you'd swipe the card through and you'd be able to hear the voice, so I could read into it and hear what I was saying, help my mind process a little bit better. There was not, of course, a lot of things I liked to read, but I was really into the Cubs, so we read, the sports section, and those were short articles I can read. And we also worked on, for some reason, she loved accents. She wanted us to always talk in these accents. Irish was her favorite, so she would teach me how to say, she said shillelagh. She's like, "If you hit me over the head with the shillelagh," you could practice Irish accent by just saying the word shillelagh. So I don't know what that was all about, but it was fun. And at the end of every Wednesday, she would say to me, "Remember, different, you see things differently and you learn things differently than most people, but different is good." So do you guys think that made me feel any better? Anyone who's... It did not. It did nothing for me, to be perfectly honest, back then. I didn't feel like different was good. I felt like different was bad. I felt like I was stupid, to be honest, pretty stupid. I felt like I was embarrassed. I was thinking, this is the one thing, everyone says reading is the one thing you need to do to be successful in life. It's so important. And read, and it was something that I really struggled to do. Before my 10th birthday, I was with my Aunt Judy, who's taught for 32 years, amazing lover of books. For her birthday every year, I would let her take me to a museum, basically was my present for her. I told her how I thought I might want to be an architect. So a few days later at my birthday, I opened up the present from her, and it was a book about architecture. An awesomely thoughtful, completely lame present for someone who hated to read. I was like, "Aunt Judy, you're killing me here. What are you doing?" And what my aunt and all these other amazing adults like you guys didn't necessarily, I'm not saying you don't understand, but what they didn't understand is that you couldn't just tell someone to love to read. They're like, "Reading is amazing. I wanted to love to read. I would have loved to read. My family loved to read. My brother, my sister, they're voracious readers. The kids at school, I remember we would sit in class and you'd have to read out loud. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is brutal." And I read out loud. The way I would have to read, I'd have to focus on every word. So it would be like, "The dog went to the," that's the way I would have to read to really read out loud, which is not like the coolest thing in the world. And so I would count ahead to get to my paragraph, and then I would just practice it over and over again. Except for this one kid, when he ever got a small paragraph, he'd be like, "Oh, my paragraph was so short. Can I please read another paragraph?" My teacher would be like, "Oh, Billy, thank you so much. Yeah, that'd be great." And I'm like, "I hate you, Billy, so much for doing that." And I really spent, after the 3rd grade, I went to another school after that, and I spent the next, all the way through really college, figuring out ways to avoid reading. I didn't talk about I'd never mentioned my learning disability to anybody ever again. I really spent, and I could go on and on about all the different ways that I avoided reading. Some of them I'm not too proud of. But one of the things I did was, especially as I got older in high school and you had to do research reports, was instead of going to the library, and in those days you had microfiche, you'd have to go on, you'd read all the articles in these thick books. It just was not happening for me. That was never going to happen. I would interview people. If I had a report on the Civil War, I would open up the phone book and look up Civil War, and it might be some store about sells artifacts or whatever. And I would call them up and I'd say, "Does anyone know anything about the Civil War there?" And they'd like hang up on me. And I'd call up another one, use one of my voices, and be like, "Oh, I just question, my voices about, I'm just curious if anyone knows anything about the Civil War." And they would say no, but they would give me another person to call in and another person. And pretty soon, I was talking to a professor at Northwestern, who was a Civil War buff. And I could interview them and ask these questions and get these great stories about the Civil War that you might not necessarily be able to get in a book. And I loved doing that, and I also loved asking the person questions about why they became interested in loving the Civil War. Like it wasn't only the Civil War that interested me, it was these people and how they developed this love. I always thought the coolest thing in the world was knowing what you wanted to be when you grow up. And it always fascinates me, people that have this and love things. I think it's so cool, people that have a passion, like the founders who started this, and I've heard some of these speeches. It's just the coolest thing in the world to me. So I developed this kind of interest in asking questions and digging deeper. And when I got my job at the Washington Post, which was totally lucked into right out of college, and I was way, way over my head. I mean, this was a joke almost. But, it was an amazing opportunity. And the high school sports editor, the one thing he told me, he said that everybody has a great story. and all you got to do is ask questions, and you can dig that out. And so that was at least one thing. It was as I was around all these incredible writers who were so much better than I was. The one thing I felt comfortable doing was talking to people and asking questions and getting their stories. But the key for me was really in college. And that's why, being here, having a college like this, I'm just so psyched for every single student that goes here. Because for me, college was, I took a social psych course, and in it in the syllabus said you had to read a book every month. And I was like, oh my gosh. Again, I would spend all my time figuring out how I was going to it just did not seem realistic. But my professor, instead of having to read the book and write about what the book was about, he said, read the book and write about how it makes you feel or what it makes you think about. So for me, this was great. I could read the first 3 sentences and my mind would already be off somewhere else. Genuinely thinking about what those first 3 sentences or first paragraph or first chapter was about. And I would write that. And I would write these papers just talking about how I feel and talking about the way I looked at things. And he loved it. And he did, he was really psyched, and I got good grades. And it was then that I made the decision that I was not going to be afraid to try anymore. And that was a really big time for me in college, because in high school, again, and all through up, I was very shy. My friends kind of knew me. I had 1 or 2 close friends, but if you asked anyone else about me, they wouldn't even know me probably. I never tried things I wanted to do. I was always kind of sit back and have regrets about not trying things. And in college, I decided that I was going to change that, and I was going to start trying things. And more importantly than trying, I was not going to be afraid to fail. I had the confidence that why does failing have to be such a bad thing? I coach all the time now. I coach all my kids' sports, and you get these parents who the team loses a couple games and they're all worked up. These 11-year-old kids are losing. I'm like, there's nothing bad about losing when you're 11 years old. We don't want to win every game. You can learn a lot from losing. Of course, they don't believe in that. It's very tough to explain. So I'm not the most popular coach in the world. But, failure does not have to be a bad thing. And if you're not afraid to try and you're not afraid to fail, the possibilities are endless. And so that was a really, really big time for me. When I had kids of my own, I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to make sure that they loved reading. I didn't want them to go through what I went through. And I knew from my experience, you can't just lecture. You can't just say, reading is important. It's really important that you do this. So that was the first time in my life that I really embraced reading. They said that you need to be an example. So when I would hear them come in, I would grab a book real quick and pretend like I was reading. Of course I wasn't, but I would pretend like I was. I'm not proud of that. I'm trying to get better. But what I would do is I would read to them all the time. From the time they were even before they could even understand, we would read books. Dr. Seuss, Peter and the Starcatchers, Series of Unfortunate Events. When my aunt told me that Atticus Finch was voted the most popular literary hero of all time, we read To Kill a Mockingbird just to see if this guy was better than Spider-Man, which he wasn't. I don't know if anyone liked that book. It wasn't even close. I was outraged at that. I'm like, he's good. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but Spider-Man, come on. When my kids pleaded for one more chapter, I would always say yes, no matter how late it got. I figured if they wanted to read again, I would keep reading. Of course, all the parents out there know what kids are like when they're overtired and they were torturous the next day, but I would do it again and again the next night and the next night after that. And we basically turned reading into a team sport. We used all the voices that I had been, all the accents that I'd used. I got a perfect Shaggy impersonation for Scooby-Doo. I used my Clinton and Bush voices for different things. I didn't know that at the time, but so we would just read and we would guess what happened next, and we would laugh all the time. And if we didn't like a book, we'd put it away. And even when my kids got older, my younger son Brody's a voracious reader, insane. He got to the point where he didn't even want to read with me anymore because he would sit next to me and be like, "Dad, you're reading these words wrong." I'm like, "Just listen. You don't have to watch every little thing." So he would just read. He would just read on his own. But my older son, we would still read together. And sometimes when he was 12 and 13, we'd read "Oh, the Places You Go" or "Planes and Cars and Things That Go," and try to find what Goldbug was, just because it's fun. You don't have to read all these big, thick, fancy books, although those are fun too sometimes. So at one point we were reading books and my kids were starting to predict the endings, and they're like, "Dad, this was good." I'm like, "No, let's just wait and see." And some of them are predictable, so they kind of challenged me to write a book that had an unpredictable ending. And I had written a nonfiction book before, and so I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write this book. And that was, talk about something that for the once kind of clicked, just writing these books. And I was always taught to write what you love, what you like to read. And so for me, if I was going to write what I liked, it was going to have to be really good because there's not very much that I like to read. So I wrote about animals, and I wrote about special powers, and I wrote about all these twists and turns, and I made the chapters really, really short because I didn't want, when the teacher tells you to read a chapter and it's 30 pages, you're like, oh my gosh. So this is, 2 or 3 pages, and I left them with cliffhangers. And I made the writing a little bit bigger. So I never understood why they make the writing so small. Even if you're a good reader, like, what are you trying to prove? I don't get that, So, I was able to do all those things, and now it's just such a gift for me to go around and speak to all these schools, and younger kids especially, and I can inspire them, or try to inspire them, to not only read, but to take chances and be creative in whatever way that speaks to them. It doesn't necessarily have to be one way. And that was when I first kind of realized, and I never even thought about this learning disability until that happened, and that's when I finally realized that was the gift that my 3rd grade teacher was talking about, and that she was right, that being different is good. And there are so many possibilities in the world, and they don't always have to follow one path. There's not one way to do something. There's not one way to learn. There's not one way to dress, thank God. There's not one way to do something, and we can all follow our own paths. And I think that's really, really important, because people used to tell me, if you want to be a writer, you've got to read a lot. And if I would have believed that, I would have never, ever done this, ever. And I'm shocked that I'm doing it right now, to be perfectly honest. And that doesn't mean it's easy. I need to say this, because I do not consider myself to be a good writer. It is a grind. And I would sit next to people at the post, and they would go, and I'd be like, oh, how do you? I was almost like in high school cheating again on the pen. I'm like, how do you do that? But for me, it is really, really hard. And I don't ever have writer's block, because I just pretend like I'm on deadline, and like I was at the post, and I type away. But when I read, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not good. And I just have to keep working on it and keep working on it. But that challenge is kind of what makes it fun for me. And they're definitely going to have bad days, when you don't think that what you're doing is worthwhile. And I remember one time I was at the Post, it was when I just started, and again, I just was so far in over my head there. But I went to my sports editor sent me out to cover this high school wrestling match. It was my first big thing, and I'd done all my research, and I was ready to go, and it was in a room probably about the size of this stage, and everyone, I don't know if you've ever been to high school wrestling, everyone's on top of each other. It was so awesome and intense, and I wrote my lead, and I was like, if guts and determination are the mark of a true sporting event, then the Super Bowl of sporting events just happened at Wakefield High School, and wrote this whole big grandiose thing. I tried to send it in, it didn't work. In those days, you had to put your phone on a payphone, and you would go in, and you have to send it in over the wires. And if that didn't work, you were torturing everybody at the office, because then you had to take dictation. So mine didn't work. I was like, oh my gosh. But I sent it in, and then you call for questions. And I called, and Neil Greenberger goes, Karton, I sent you to cover a high school sporting event, a high school wrestling match. It's not the Super Bowl. And he goes, not good. Click. And that's a perfect impersonation, by the way, of Neil. And so about a couple days later, I was in there, and feeling, of course, terrible about myself. And there was this big high school football game that they needed to cover. It was 100 miles away. It was going to be over Thanksgiving, and they couldn't get anyone to do it. And I'm like, okay, I usually go home for Thanksgiving, but I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna be a go-getter. So I went to him, and I'm like, Neil, I can go do that. I'll go and cover that game for you. And he goes, that's okay, Karton, we're good. And it turns out they didn't even get anybody to cover the game. So I sat there when I was driving home for Thanksgiving. I was thinking to myself, I am as low at the Washington Post as you could possibly be right now. But the thing about it is, I didn't feel bad about it at all. I was like, I got no place to go but up. And it made me realize again that just not being afraid to be down. Of course I was going to be low. I didn't know what I was doing, and it was kind of almost a feeling of inspiration where I got no place to go but up here. And writing on deadline is an incredible, scary experience. And sometimes you feel great about yourself, and sometimes you feel terrible about yourself, but you're always feeling something about yourself, and it's always that challenge that I loved, and I think is really the value of what we do and what we try to teach and how we try to live. So if you are anything like me, then you have probably zoned out for about 3/4 of the speech by now. So I will finish up by saying this, as I said in the beginning, that there's really nothing cooler to me than chasing a dream, not necessarily attaining the dream, but just having the courage to try. So many people don't try, and if they try once and fail, then they stop trying. But having that courage to chase a dream, to me, there's nothing cooler. And having a place like Beacon that can help those dreams, help you try to accomplish those dreams, is such an amazing thing. It really reminds me, I was thinking about this last night, of the X-Men Mansion. Does anyone ever watch the X-Men or anything like that? Thank you. So of the X-Men Mansion, a place where people with extraordinary abilities can come, be accepted for who they are, and be inspired to go on and do great things. And I promise everybody this, and this is, I'm not saying this to be self-deprecating, I promise everybody here is 100 times smarter than me. There's no doubt in my mind, it's definitely true. And if I can do some of these things, then I promise you guys can do or become anything you can imagine. So thank you very, very much for having me. I really appreciate it.